With us today, we have the very soon about to be Dr. Baheerathan Murugavel, and he is just finishing his PhD at the Indian Institute of Science, Education, and Research. And he's handed in his thesis, his dissertation, and everything. So that means he's like just about there. So, about to be Dr. Murugavel, why don't you introduce us to what do you study?
Yeah. So, hi everyone. Thank you for inviting me in the show. So, yeah, I am Baheerathan Murugavel. So, I'm a final year PhD student in the Indian Institute of Science, Education and Research, Thiruvananthapuram, Southern India. So, my for my PhD, my major focus was visual ecology in this non-echolocating family of bats, the fruit-eating bats. So, uh, out of all the bat families, there is only this one family called family Pteropodidae, which consists of species which do not echolocate. So all the other bat species are known to produce this ultrasound echolocation through which they navigate. But there is this group of bats which predominantly rely on vision and olfaction for their navigation and orientation. So I studied the visual ecology of those animals for my PhD. So in India, there are more than 130 species of bats, out of which we have 12 species of fruit bats, and each have their own habitat and roosting ecology per se. Roost is the place where bats spend their time in the day. And for my PhD, what I did was I took three species of fruit bats, all sympatric, which means they share the same habitat, and I compared their vision. So what is different among these three species is their roosting ecology itself. So I chose one species which roosts completely inside dark caves, and I also chose one species which hangs in open trees, which is the flying foxes, which you can see in large numbers. One of the biggest bats found in the world. So there is this extremes of dark versus bright roosting species, and I also took a tent making species, which means
Okay.
they do not completely roost in darkness or brightness. So they make these animals alter plant foliage, and they
Mhm.
make this tent kind of structure which is exposed to kind of intermediate levels of light during the day. And I compared how vision differs in these three species. So
That's
that is
so cool. Yeah, and so just as a
yeah.
quick recap for people, because most people I know aren't very familiar with bats. So these fruit bats, unlike a lot of the bats we think of, like you were just saying, they don't use the sonar, they don't use the echolocation as much because fruit do not put up much of a chase. You don't have to like use this high-tech ultrasound to find the fruit. You can just look for it, smell it, and then grab it.
Yeah.
So these fruit-eating species of bats actually have very good, from what I understand, they have better eyesight than we do. Is that correct? At least at
Yeah,
night.
in the in the night they can see better than us. Yeah.
Yeah. And you were talking about the roosting ecology, and that's just what bat biologists use to talk about where is the bat sleeping, hanging out, basically, when it's not flying around, where is it chilling? And often this is, during the day when the bats are sleeping. And so this is a really cool link that you've made because yeah, you're like, okay, some of these bats hang out in caves where it's very dark. Some of them just like hang in the trees where it's very light during the day. They're exposed to the light. And then some of them are in this in between thing where they basically, from what I understand, and you can correct me, they have like the tent making bats you were talking about. If you have like a big leaf, they often will like kind of chew along the vein of the leaf in the center or something. And so this
Yeah.
big leaf will kind of like collapse. And then the bats will hang in they'll hang upside down in like the collapsed portion of the leaf, correct?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I'm going to guess your hypothesis. Was your hypothesis that like the bats that hang out in caves are the most sensitive to human sources of light, like light pollution and light, like street lights and stuff like that, and the bats that are in the trees are less sensitive to it? Or is it the
Yeah,
reverse?
yeah. So that was not just artificial lighting. First, I started with natural lighting itself per se, the moonlight and even the twilight timings. So when they emerge out and things like that. Yeah, basically what you said was my working hypothesis. I was trying to see which is more sensitive and which is not, and I also took an anatomical approach where I estimated their spatial resolution using their retina. And so basically try to estimate at what distances they could resolve objects. Is there a difference between their day roosting ecology and their visual modalities itself.
Do you
So
mean
yeah,
just like how far away they can see the objects?
yeah, how far they can resolve objects. Yeah, based on their retinal anatomy, it was like, yeah, I was trying.
Oh,
That was
cool.
one part of my work. Yeah.
Cool. Any questions, Christian, or
Yeah, actually, yes, I find this very intriguing. Well, first of all, because I come from an astronomy background, so the word light pollution means something different to me than to you. But anyway, I just to go a little bit broader, I read on this one Zoom. I'm always interested to see, where all these bats come from. I found there are about 26 species of fruit bats. Are all these fruit bats similar? They have no echolocation abilities. Are they all the same, or are they different again?
Okay, so there are two families of frugivorous bats per se. One is in the old world fruit bats and the new world fruit bats.
Okay.
So the one which I'm talking about is the old world fruit bats, which comes under the family Pteropodidae.
Thank you.
And for yeah, and the new world fruit bats, frugivorous bats, it comes under the family Philostomidae. Philostomidae also has a diverse group of bats which feed on variety of things, and a part of some of the species in that family also are frugivorous, and they are present only in the new world. So these are
Christian,
the two families which are, yeah.
I was just saying, Christian, I'm writing these words down in an email for you so you can you can share. A lot of times our audience wants to know how things are shared and are spelled. And so we like in the chat, we can put it out so it's spelled easily for people. Yeah. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
And also because I studied optics, I'm very interested in you talked about the retina and their visual perception. How does it compare with a human being, or are they also able to see a little bit more on the near infrared, and what type of spectra are you talking about there? Hello?
Did you hear that? Oh, did something happen? I wonder.
Maybe we lost him. 1 second.
Yeah.
Can you hear us? No, I think he's lost us. Okay.
No.
Okay. We'll wait.
Yes. Oh, wait. Well, I will share my one fruit bat anecdote while we're maybe getting him back here.
I'm writing to him.
Yeah, I'll check my email too. But I caught bats one time in the sort of tropics, the New World tropics in Puerto Rico, and I was gluing a transmitter onto its back, these little radio trackers that just fall off after a couple weeks. And I was used to working with these insect eating bats that like their limbs, their hind legs are kind of like just not free of their tail membrane. They're just kind of like their hind legs are just these little like non-functioning things dangling behind them, basically.
Okay.
And
So,
yeah, he's back.
Can you actually hear us?
Yeah, can you?
Yes. Now
Okay. Sorry, Georgia. Because of your time constraint, we have to get on. Okay. So
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, well, anyways, the first time I was just telling a story about the first time I ever tried to glue a transmitter on the back of a fruit bat, and it reached around and grabbed it with its back leg, and I almost glued its foot to its back because they're so dexterous from being able to grab onto fruit. I was like, oh my gosh. So that was my one fruit bat experience. But anyways, yeah, Christian's question.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting, Jordan. It's really interesting. I didn't know that they could even do that. But anyway, my question was, I was more interested in their visual perception because you were talking about their very good eyesight. So how does that compare with human beings, or can they see maybe a little bit more? Do we know something about the spectral response of what they see and what they don't see? Is it specific for the fruits that they eat, or how does that work?
okay, so in the retinal perspective, bats mostly have a rod-dominated retina. So they might there are cones, but it is not that good as the diurnal animals like primates and humans. So in the day, if you take humans will have a better vision, and sensitivity will also differ accordingly. But in the nocturnal point of view, it is so since they have a rod-dominated retina, they have adapted for the nocturnal vision, and in that case, they are better than humans in the night vision aspect. But they have color vision studies are very much sparse in the bat world. But so there are evidences of they having cones cone photoreceptors and stuff like that. But still, there is so much to explore in this avenue, especially.
But if you look at the rod response, is that more into the blue then? Because usually our rods are a little bit more blue responsive than they are sort of yellow-green response. Do we know something about that? Or, with the sensitivity actually of their night vision? Is that?
Yeah, so again, there is differences between species and families. So for fruit bats, yeah, yes, they are rod dominated vision. They have rod dominated retina, and so sensitivity wise, there are very few studies, so I cannot exactly remember the actual information about that. But yeah, so there is so much to do in that. But yeah, very much information is not that available for that field for now. Yeah.
So you mentioned that you had some slides to share with us. Would you like to share those now?
Yeah. So first, I wanted to say I started with understanding how these three species respond to natural lighting, and interestingly, I did find the cave roosting species prefers darker time points. So they tend to come out in astronomical twilight, while the other two species were starting to fly out in civil twilight, and they completed their flight activity in the early morning also by uh, in the darker time points. It was the dark roasting species was trying to finish their flight activity in the darker time points. That is when I started thinking what will happen if they are exposed to artificial lighting, because all these three species are known to roost in urban habitats. They're very much urbanized, and they're exposed to constant levels of artificial lighting. So I did compare how roost light exposure affects their emergence and return activity in the cave roosting species and in the flying foxes. So again, we did find a species-specific response. For the cave roosting species, what I found was emergence was significantly delayed in the light-polluted colony. So that is what I've shared some photos also about the light-polluted roost. So the naturally.
That means the one species that roosts in the cave, it tends to come out later when there's more human light pollution.
Yes, yes. Even though in the natural conditions, it was coming out late than the normal flying foxes and the bright roosting species. But when light pollution comes into the picture, it was even more delayed.
Yeah, just to clarify, because you're using some actually very good astronomical terms that not everybody may be familiar to, because you're using the word civil twilight, which we know, but then astronomical darkness, astronomical twilight, that people know, that is when it's absolutely dark. And there comes my question: what happens during full moon? Does their behavior change during full moon, or?
So at the roosting site, what I found, so there are again differences with at the foraging site versus roosting sites. In the roosting site, what I found was the dark roosting species was altering its behavior as a colony with respect to moon phases. So the colony which I studied was in an agricultural spring well. So bats were roosting underground inside a well, inside the tunnels. So during full moons, there was this 1.5-hour window between moonrise and moonlight actually hitting the roost entrance. So the bats were coming out through the wells opening only. So there was only one entrance. So what happened on full moon nights was most of the like almost 60% of the colony was emerging out before the. Yeah, so more than 60% of the colony was emerging out before that full moon was hitting the roost entrance. But that was not the case for the other two species. There was no difference in, at least in emergence activity with respect to moon phases. So they were pretty much going the same way in all moon phases. But only in the dark roosting species, there was this difference. But at foraging sites, people have reported reduced activity on full moon night on all the fruit bat species, and that could be correlated to avoiding predators or getting seen by other animals and all. Yeah, but in roosting sites, this was the case.
I was going to ask, because like in addition to just these cave roosting bats are used to being in darker environments, they're also highly congregated oftentimes, like in one particular site, like one particular cave, which can make them more sensitive to predators, right? It's very easy for a couple hawks or something to just wait in the twilight, catch them as they're all coming out. And so, yeah, I was going to ask, like, how much of this do you think is related to like them avoiding predators, especially.
Yeah, so moonlight avoidance is always correlated with this predator avoidance in the nights. But for the flying foxes, the normal other bat like hawks or owls are not that much of a predator in the emergence time for the flying foxes, and they were pretty much emerging in brighter time points. So yeah, predator avoidance is very much linked to behavior at the foraging site, the foraging behavior. But in the roosting site, what I found was this.
Do you want to share some of the pictures maybe through your screen and just explain some of these, please?
Or the slides, yeah.
That would be good because it'll give more of a
Yeah, definitely.
Hmm.
And also, just for clarification, you mentioned the flying foxes. Those are the ones that hang out in the trees, right?
Yeah. I'm just sharing my screen.
Okay.
Yeah, can you see it?
Yes.
Yes, we do see pteropodids of southern India.
Yeah.
So the pteropodids, to remind us, this is just the old world fruit bats.
Fruit bats, yeah. So in southern India, there are 6 species of fruit bats, and we have only one open hanging one, which is the Indian flying fox. And there are 2 tent making or foliage roosting species, which is the greater and lesser short-nosed fruit bats. And they are harem forming in the animals, which means male will be constructing the tent and females will be recruited, and the total harem size can go up to 5 to 25 individuals. And then there are 3 cave roosting species. So for my PhD, what I did was I took one representative of each roosting type and compared their visual activity, visual behavior, so foraging behavior, and their visual systems. So this was my main question: how does visual ecology differ among the 3 species? So for this, I took 4 approaches. One was studying their natural behavior with respect to moon phases at their roosting sites. Then I also did some tracking studies by putting transmitters on the flying foxes and see if their movement is anyways affected by moonlight and other lighting conditions. And then I also took a neuroanatomical approach to estimate how far they can see or how far they can resolve objects, and also their what is the resolution, and is that having any correlation with their day roost exposure. And finally, since I did find a difference in their behavior with respect to natural lighting itself, I also asked how will artificial lighting in terms of light pollution influence their behavior. So for uh, for that, I will show you the roosting sites itself. Just a second. Yeah. Yeah, can you see it?
Yes.
Yeah, so here in the left, I'm showing you my study colonies of the cave roosting species or the dark roosting species. So if you follow my cursor, you can see in the top left, you can see the agricultural well in which the bats were roosting, and the second thing with the arrow, yellow arrow indicates the tunnels in which bats were roosting. So this was inside in the middle of agricultural farmland. So around 500 meters to 1 kilometer, there was no source of artificial lighting. But the same species, which was also found in this temple, which is so some 60 kilometers away from the naturally lit roost. And the same species of bats were found roosting inside these temple towers, which were constantly exposed to lightings from the shops which sell religious merchandise. So what happens here is, under the natural condition, nightfall happens by the end of astronomical twilight, which is around 7 o'clock in the night, in the evening. And but for the temple roost, what happens is, it gets dark only after the temple shops switch off their lights, which means they go up to 9:30 or even 10 in the night, after which only the corridors become completely dark.
Wow.
So what happens, what I did was comparing their emergence activity, like when is the first bat coming out, the time of first emergence, the time of peak emergence, like when is the the peak emergence activity or the burst of activity is happening, and also when the last bat comes back. So overnight I did whole night observations from 6 in the evening to 7 in the morning, and counted the number of bats coming out with respect to time. And I did find the timing of first bat to come out itself was significantly delayed, like more than 40 minutes there was a delay in the light polluted colony compared to the naturally lit agricultural well. And they were also because of this delayed emergence, there was a very delayed return activity also. So as if you remember, as I told earlier, in the naturally lit colony, bats were completing activity by nautical twilight in the morning, which was relatively darker than the other species. Here it was, I found bats returning even after sunrise. So they were returning back even when it was brighter, exposing them to more predators in the morning. And this significant delay in the night also pushes them to uh, being at a competitive disadvantage when it comes to foraging in a landscape where there are other fruit bats also. So it is having a negative effect in this species. But in the right, if you see, this is the five. I'm just showing the locations of 5 colonies in my study landscape, and overlaid on a light pollution map. So yellow indicates more light pollution, and green indicates less light pollution. And I compared the same emergence activity for the 5 colonies for 1 month. And what I did find was, here an opposite effect was observed. So what happened in the flying foxes was, in the highly urbanized colony, which is in the rightmost, bats were starting to emerge even before sunset, which was never the case in any of the naturally lit colonies. And it was significantly earlier in the flying foxes, but and this was again counterintuitive, because I was expecting an effect somewhat similar to in all fruit bats, but what I found was the flying fox, which is exposed to more urbanization and daylight, is showing an opposite effect. So from my observations, what I could say is, there is light pollution is having species specific effects, and it needs to be explored in frugivorous bats, which predominantly rely on light based cues for their navigation and orientation. So yeah, so that is pretty much about this work.
Hmm.
That's so cool. So, I mean, yeah, why do you think that is? So the fruit bats, or sorry, the flying foxes, the ones that roost in the trees, they are coming out even earlier when there's more light pollution, right? And they're already the first emerging species. I guess it's just they don't care that much about light. And so if it's,
Yeah,
yeah, why do you think that is? Do you think the light helps them find food or?
yeah, there could be multiple reasons now. For now, that was again, as I said, it was data from 1 month of observations, and after exactly after that, COVID happened, and I could not revalidate the same by increasing their sample sizes and stuff. But it could be because of their daylight exposure, and they could be comfortable in flying in bright light, unlike the cave roosting species, because they are not exposed to daylight, and their sensitivity itself could be comparatively different to the flying foxes. And they are also highly urbanized. It's not just the light pollution which is the factor there. So as I said, it was in the middle of a city. It was in the city center. So there could be other factors like human activity, which is not that much in the roosting context itself. So even though the light polluted cave roosting situation, even though they were in the temple, the roosts were exposed to light only below. But for the flying foxes, it was not the case, because there was high activity under the trees, and people were constantly moving around and traffic noise, and there could be many urbanization effects. So yeah.
So this is absolutely fascinating. So where you found in these urban areas where you found exactly the opposite effect, that they came out earlier, despite the light. How do the predators there vary from more urban areas compared maybe to the caves that you have out? Is there a difference there that may explain this?
For flying foxes, at least in my observations, what I've seen is crows are found to be attacking these animals, both in the daytime and in the evenings. So before emergence, most of the times I've seen crows trying to chase off mothers with pups, and if the mother drop the pup, the crows will try to eat them. Other than that, for flying foxes, humans are the next predator. Sometimes I've observed hunting at the roosting sites, and after this outbreaks and stuff, people were starting to burn crackers and stuff like that to under the roost to disturb them. So there are human predators, and so that is the next part which I'm coming to, like the conservation aspect and how this human perspective changes pre and post pandemic. So for flying foxes, this was the case, but for the cave roosting species, one, they are smaller, so there are bird predators like shikras, and owls also come to the roost, and they just wait in the entrance and they just catch their bats as they emerge. And for most of the cave species, the all the bats come out through one entrance, so that is an easy point for the predators to catch them. But for flying foxes, that is not the case. So they just emerge in all directions from the trees, and also they're huge. And for as far as my observation, I've seen only crows chasing them occasionally.
Yeah, the crows are amazing how they'll just go after even the much bigger birds and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So we do have a question from Facebook, which was about, I will summarize it. So this question is from Bahawana Busal, and they say, this sounds interesting. This kind of talk show can promote coexistence between humans and wildlife. So bats are highly vulnerable from climate change and anthropogenic pressure, but current conservation practices have created gaps in its conservation to compare to the other large mammals and birds. Can you please suggest how we can promote conservation research for bats in such a situation? I think they mean like, yeah, conserving bats versus like some other animals that maybe get more attention.
Yeah, so that is where the Indian perspective comes into picture. I think that is a good point to move to my next part of my slides. So yeah, I'll just share because
yeah, perfect.
That is actually a very good question to start this part. Yeah. Yeah, can you see it?
Yes.
Yeah. So I will start with some negative incidences which happened pretty much after COVID. But before COVID also, there were 2 years of Nipah outbreak, which exactly coincided with some of my fieldwork times in southern India. So flying foxes were already in the radar. People were scared of them and they were trying to shoo them out. And after COVID, mostly because of this press releases and misconceived news articles, people were putting flying foxes in the news, and they were trying to cut roosting trees and trying to shoo bats off by sealing their openings, cave openings, and stuff like that. So that is when we started to. We took this as an opportunity to give more knowledge about bats and to help them promote conservation. So for that, what I'm going to show here is so in India we have this long-lasting cultural and literary perceptions among different animals and wildlife. So I personally took this as an avenue to promote conservation. So what I'm showing here is one of the literary example. So we have in southern India something called as the Sangam literature, which means they are poetry pieces dating back to 2000 years old. And there are references of so many wildlife and animals and ecology of the past in poem. So, and there are references of fruit bats also. So here I show a poem where fruit bats are considered as an allegory, and they're compared in a poetry which symbolizes love. So what happens here is the heroine who has sent her husband for war is just waiting alone in her home for a long time, and there is a fruit bat roost, preferably flying fox, I suppose, and she's just seeing the flying foxes emerging out in the evening, and leaving the tree empty, going to the fruiting tree. So she compares this scene to her emotion of being alone, like the roosting tree being alone. She is being alone without her husband, and she's just starting the poem with that. So flying foxes are being referred to convey this kind of an emotion of love in this 2,000-year-old poem. And there are also other references, at least from my knowledge, I have 6 or 7 examples of poems which symbolizes fruit bats for sense of time. So they compare when bats come out, it is evening time has arrived. So they consider bat as a signal of evening times, and they also consider in poetry they also show bats as an indicator of a wealthy garden in a kingdom, and so on and so forth. So bats are always portrayed in this 2,000-year-old poems in India as a positive note, and there has been no negative references. So I took this as a starting point, and I went, since most of my observations and field work was in semi-urban and urbanized areas, I could interact with public more because with this information. And that comes to this next interesting example. So what I show here is a news article, and here, as I showed in my earlier light pollution study, also bats roost in temples. Temples provide alternate rocky roosting sites for many species, and here is a small village temple where this is in the leftmost you see the temple tower, inside which is a hollow tunnel in which bats and geckos roost. So in this temple, what the practice is, when somebody goes and offers a prayer to this deity in front of so the deity is just placed below the tower inside. So bats are roosting above, and the deity itself is inside, below that. So whenever somebody prays, and if a bat flies out of this thing after they offer their prayer, the people consider that as the god has answered their prayer or just listened to the prayer. So because of this kind of belief system, people do not attack the roost, or they just protect these kind of roosting sites inside the temple. So even if as a bat researcher, if I want to go and study them, they just don't allow me that easily. So I need to have a dialogue with them and explain that I'm also trying to do good for these animals, and that is when they allow me. So this is one kind of an example where a positive cultural perception exists already in practice for years. Next, there are also concept of the sacred groves. So okay, so the dark roosting species or the cave roosting bats are found in this rocky temples. But what happens to the flying foxes is where these kind of sacred grooves comes into picture. So what happens here is the temple per se itself. In the left, you can see the small cement construction, which is the temple. But the area around it for a particular diameter is forest. So it is a sacred forest, and flying foxes roost inside that. And the whole area itself is considered as a sacred space. And what people do here is they just do not take fruits from these gardens, and they just leave it for the animals. And even if you go and try to if somebody tries to hunt this bats inside this, they say that is going to trigger the anger of this deity inside the temple. And the whole place is considered as sacred, and this belief system kind of conserves these animals for more than 40-50 years at least.
That's
And in the
really
left you can,
beautiful. It's sorry, is part of it that these fruit bats, they're not just eating the fruit, they also help spread the seeds around sometimes, right? Because they will take the fruit and like fly somewhere else with it and then eat the fruit and drop the seeds. So by like
exactly.
preserving this sacred forest here, it helps maintain, fruit trees like growing all around it in the city or the forest or whatever. That's such a great
Yeah.
idea.
Yeah. So this whole system kind of this area is not touched by human activity. So they just scared to enter because of the fear of getting the wrath of the deity, and this kind of conserves these animals inside. So in the left you can see a cave temple. This is pretty much common in across India. So what I'm showing is an example from southern India. So the inside cave also there are some deities in which people just go and pray often. and those caves are also roosting bats. And because of this constant human activity, these bats are habituated to human activity under these caves, and they just don't get disturbed even when the priest here just offers prayers or rings bells or something. So this kind of system is already existing before even conservation could be brought into the picture. So this belief system is already there in the society here, and that is where I'm trying to start bringing the positive stories about bats. So after COVID, these were the examples which helped me promote bat conservation here, and it was actually having a good response also. So what I'm showing here is examples of news articles where there are so many villages in Tamil Nadu, and Tamil Nadu is a part in southern India. In most of the southern India, most of these villages kind of conserve these bat roost, especially flying foxes, and they just don't even believe if we say that they spread diseases. So somebody goes and after COVID, if somebody goes and says these are the animals which are causing COVID pandemic, they are strongly against that idea, and they say that these bats are here for since I was a child, and there is nothing has happened till now, and we don't believe these things, and they just don't try to show these animals off or not. But in the urban case, an exact opposite situation is there, mostly because of misconception, social media influence, and not reading the facts correctly. Mostly this urban public is the one which gets scared, and they try to cut roosting trees or seal caves and stuff like that. So more knowledge is like kind of people in urban areas is the where we had to focus on giving more information about these bats. Under the rural India, we have so much of already pre-existing conservation practices, and in India, especially flying foxes are considered as protectors of villagers, bringers of luck, and they are even considered as bringers of wealth and prosperity. Unlike the Western idea of being considered as a bad omen or something like that. Of course, there are those kind of ideas also are also there, but this good association is there in most of this southern Indian villages, and even in many villages across the country. So this is the example which I am trying to promote wherever I go, and I'm already showing that there are this year-old, century-old positive associations with animals, and this is very much helping in conservation also. As you are pointing out, it helps in establishments of seed dispersal, and there are even villages which don't use fireworks for birds and bats in their villages. They are eco-friendly, and they're promoting human wildlife coexistence and avoiding conflict. And when we went and asked to these villages in the light of the COVID pandemic, as I said earlier, they were strongly for bats rather than rather like the urban public, which was strongly against bats, even though they don't understand which species is carrying coronavirus or something like that. So these village people were, even though they don't know the specifics of this whole conservation aspects or the biology of this viral spread and zoonosis, they are strongly for bats just because of their belief systems, which is existing for long years. And that is something which is good from the Indian perspective, and that is something which I wanted to show to you also. So we have just compiled all this information into a review paper which was out last year. So we so what we have tried to do is we just collected this cultural perceptions of bats across the Asian Pacifics in folklores and poems and all these cultural aspects, just to say it's not just India or some countries across the Asia Pacific. There are so many positive associations with bats, and that was something which we wanted to promote to in a conservation point of view, especially to reduce human bat conflict. So here's the review paper, and it's an open access one, and I can also share this. So for interested people, you can go and read this also. So it is a compilation of so many positive association across the Asian Pacific in different cultures and different folklores, where people try to conserve bats just through their belief systems, culture, and their existing long-lasting ideas of strong human-animal coexistence.
That was amazing. Thank you so much for sharing with us. And yeah, I just looked up the paper and found it. I'll send it to Christian and he can share the link during the show. Um, well, I mean, that was just amazing. Thank you so much for sharing all of your research with us and all of your thoughts and perceptions about the cultural ways in which bats are involved too. That was so cool to hear about.
Yeah, I have
Yeah.
just one more question because you were also talking about the sense of smell, right? Didn't mention much about that. How does that help them, or how does it differ from other species?
Okay, so it all started with my interest in sense of smell only. So basically, I'm a bioengineer who did masters in genomics, but I started studying bats during my master's dissertation only.
Mhm.
And my first project was understanding olfactory communication in this tent making bat. So as I showed earlier, it is a harem forming species where male will construct the tents, unlike in the new world tent making bats where both genders will be involved in tent making. In this particular species, males will make the tents. They will go and chew leaves and they'll alter foliage to make the tent, and females will be recruited. And this tent is like a territory for the male. No two males will coexist inside the same tent, and males will come try to capture another male's tent, and there will be high aggression. Sometimes males will construct multiple tents as backups and all. So females just choose the tents based on the quality of the tent and stuff like that. So what happens in this species is every evening they start every bat before emergence. They will groom each other. Grooming is just licking and scratching their own body. So in this species, this concept of social grooming happens. So it is also known in vampire bats and few other species. Social grooming is one individual grooming the other, and the third individual coming together, and they just groom together. So what happens is that in this species also there is the social grooming, where at a point of time before emergence they all become a ball. It's called as a grooming ball, and they just completely drench themselves with saliva. They lick each other and they just drench themselves with saliva. So my question was, is this behavior having any olfactory importance? So is this because the male is trying to register his scent to the female, so that females when they come back they will remember the scent and choose them? And that was my master's dissertation. And I did some captive experiments where I housed different groups of males and females together inside a captive room setup for a month, and presented order the smell of the males in which they spent their time for the month, and novel males. And I just asked the females to choose between them, and I found females were choosing the uh, option of the smell of the 10 male which they know well. So, and they also choose this tent, even though there was no order. The males, as I said, they will lick the tent and they'll decorate the tent and they'll make all these kind of things to beautify the tent. So even if there was no male order, if you just keep a tent for tent without any this olfactory cues, females are going there. Even if you mask the visual cues and we just do, they just have this kind of a sense of smell. And males also use this in the night. If you see, when the females return back, males will try to fan their wings like this when the female enters the tent, so that we presume that this could be to spread their scent to the female. And as the female comes, he will just close the wings. The males will just lick their wings like this, and they'll just spread the odor like this in the when the female returns. And once the female comes, he will just try to hug the female like this and arrest the female. So I've shared an image of that also. So
That's
so so they yeah.
That's fascinating. Do we have any idea or any scale how that compares, for example, to the sense of a dog or so? How, or is there any comparison at all for this?
Yeah. So olfaction is, as you said, it is well studied in many canines like dogs and stuff. But yeah, so bats also, especially fruit bats, are known to use smell for finding food. But my dissertation and this idea was to study how they use the scent for in a social context, how to identify mates. This has been studied well in different species. There are even bat species which has scent glands, which is exclusively used for this purpose. But in this species, it was something interesting because As I said, males do extensively decorate their tent, and they just involved in so many interesting behaviors to just have this olfactory component in them. So we were trying to explore how, at what extent the females perceive them. And yes, they do have, they could recognize difference between different males by smell. So yeah, and already in the foraging context, there has been extensive studies. They know to find ripe versus unripe fruits, and they can find differences between fruits based on their the fruit order and stuff like that. But in the social context also, they do this thing. So yeah.
So Baheerathan, that was very, very interesting. Thank you so much. So finally, my question is always, where do you see yourself in the future? Where are you going to go? What are your plans? You're very passionate about science. You're very passionate. I mean, you talked about engineering, that you had this path of engineering and then biology, but you seem to have taken the biological route, right? So where do you see yourself in the next years or in 10 years? Where are you going?
Yeah, so since I started bat studying observing bats, again the idea of me starting bat behavior itself is interesting. So Georgia might know there is this 1993 study from Tom Kunz where that was the starting point of me starting to observe wild animals from
Mm-hmm.
different backgrounds. So there is this behavior called alloparental care. What happens is in the flying foxes, which they hang in open trees, when they deliver the pup, uh, uh, what happens is experienced females come and try to help the delivering mother by getting the pup out, or helping imitating vaginal cramps and all. So she just comes and hangs in front of the delivering mother, and she just shows how to deliver the pup carefully and stuff like that. So this is called as an allo maternal care. So two or three experienced female individuals come and help another bat to get the baby out. So it is highly that point was when I started studying bats, and in the future I am planning to continue in bat research only, especially preferably behavior. So in the longer run, I intend to continue with bats by studying different types of behavior in the wild and captivity. And as I said, there is so much needs to be explored, and especially in the context of sensory ecology and in fruit bats itself. So yeah, so that is where I'm seeing. Uh, Immediately, also, I'm trying for postdoc positions to understand different behaviors in bats. So yeah, I
Well,
want to continue with understanding these animals better.
well, Baheerathan Murugavel, thank you so much for this very intriguing interview. Keep up your passion. You're doing wonderful work. And thank you